I'm Esme Berg, the interim president and executive director of the New Amsterdam History Center, in case you don't know who I am. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees of NAHC, I'd like to welcome you here all tonight to hear a fascinating talk by Shaun Sayres, A Dangerous Liberty, Mohawk-Dutch Relations and the Colonial Gunpowder Trade. I've heard the talk and I really loved it. It was really, really interesting. We're in a very, very special place tonight, this St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, as I guess you probably, most of you know, but good old Peter Stuyvesant is buried out there in the garden. And I'll just, in case you don't know, tell you a little bit about the church. It's one of the most famous and important architectural landmarks in New York City. Its origins date back to 1660, when Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General of the Dutch Colonial of New Netherlands, built the first chapel on the site. Though the structure he designed is long gone, his remains still lie in a sealed vault at St. Mark's. So I thought this was a very special place for us to have this talk tonight. I want to say a special word of welcome to Sophie van Dormelaan from the Consulate General of the Netherlands, and thank the Consulate and the Dutch culture for their continued support of our projects and programs. And welcome to many of you who are NAHC patrons for your support, without which we couldn't have these programs and do the other things that we do. NAHC is in the midst of a period of growth and renewal, and we're very excited this week to have welcomed 3 new board members to our Board of Trustees. So we will have exciting projects going forward and new beginnings. Starting with this coming May, we are working on a program called the Dutch to the Rescue. We're a panel of representatives from Dutch companies working to help New York with its water management will present their views. Please check your inboxes for more information about that. It will be coming soon. And now I would like to welcome our New Amsterdam History Center Board of Trustee member, Pat Bonamy, who is a New York University professor emerita, to introduce Shaun Sayres. Thank you very much.
I want to be sure that you all can hear, because in this vaulted church, inevitably there's something of an echo. Can you hear me okay? And in the back as well. Okay, then that's fine. Welcome to all of you. As I often do in introducing these talks, I like to do a little scene setting, just briefly. We are going to be hearing about a very interesting topic tonight. And it has to do with Indians, as we used to call them. But I want to ask you, some of you, it looks like you might be old enough to remember the days when history books, textbooks, would give you this scenario. The Europeans arrived in the New World. It was all new. There was hardly anybody there. They were the ones who cleared the land. They were the ones who took over. And you maybe heard a word or two about Thanksgiving, some kind of a Thanksgiving ceremony that involved some local people. But then you got right into the story of the Europeans, of course. But in the last 30 years or so, this story has changed for historians. As professional historians have looked into the story more deeply, it's actually been more than 30 years, and there have always been some people who were smarter than the rest of us were about this story. We know now that there were hundreds of thousands of people occupying the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, which later became the United States. And that those people, the indigenous people of this area, had a history, a very deep, centuries-long history. They had a culture in the arts, in music, a culture of their own that was quite advanced. They had an economy in which they dealt with the other indigenous peoples in the area. And they had diplomacy as well, because they had to get along with or go to war against the fellow indigenous peoples. So this was hardly a passive group that was just accepting what happened to them. And as we know, many bad things happened to them, with diseases being spread, wars occurring. But in addition, they were really very smart. The Native Americans made alliances, for example, with the Dutch in order to take power from the English Empire that was elsewhere in North America, or the Dutch would make alliances with the Indians against the French. This was a very complex society. And so that's the way we want to think about this topic. I can hardly read what I'm got here. And it's a very exciting field of history. Right now, all kinds of things are happening. There were over 400 different tribes occupying North America, and they all seem to have their historians these days. So you're very lucky that you're going to be getting the latest news, because our speaker for the evening, Shaun Sayres, is right in the midst of this developing story, which will continue to grow and become even more exciting as we learn more about these peoples. Shaun Sayres is a doctoral student at Clark University, where he's working with Wim Klooster, a name that would be familiar to many of you. Wim is a leading historian of the Dutch in the 17th century in the Atlantic world. And so Shaun is working with Wim, which is the best person you could possibly find for his interests. And he studies, Shaun, is studying colonial American history, the Atlantic world, the Age of Revolutions. And his dissertation research focuses on intercultural encounters and partnerships in the Atlantic world, with special attention to New Netherland and the 17th century. Shaun has taught at the San Ignacio de Loyola University in Peru, and also at the University of New Hampshire, where he took his earlier work. And he is currently a teaching assistant at Clark University. And he gave me just a little brief comment on what he's going to be speaking about tonight, what he's drawn from his larger dissertation work, if I can read it in this light. This lecture, he says, flips the traditional narrative by demonstrating how Europeans depended on Native American allies for the success of their colonies, and often survival in 17th century North America. So just what I was mentioning before, we're going to get a very different side of the story. And you've already heard the title of the talk tonight, but just to repeat again, Shaun will be talking about a dangerous liberty, Mohawk-Dutch relations, and the colonial gunpowder trade, 1639-1665. So it is my pleasure to present Shaun Sayres.
Thank you, Pat, for that introduction. You'll have to excuse me, I am coming over a cold. If I shook your hand, don't worry, it was last week, but I'm still a little congested, and I'm dealing with that today. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. I had a problem with my last talk, and we're not going to do that today. So thank you, Pat, for that wonderful, thoughtful introduction. It's always nice to segue the audience into these sorts of things. Thank you, Esma Berg and the New Amsterdam Research Center, as well as the affiliated institutions that could be here, or have me here be here today. And thank you to everyone for coming. I am very flattered that people want to come and listen to me nerd out about this stuff for 40 to 50 minutes. So it's always a real pleasure, and we're going to get right into it. I think Pat might have taken the first page of my talk. That's okay, because there's a preface that's not written there. Thank you. I love a challenge. My remote control isn't working either, so we'll work on this. If I could, I don't know if maybe the battery died? It was working. In the meantime, so I want to preface with this talk with a couple things today. For one, it's not, but that's the image I want up. I'm not interested primarily, these are important questions, but they're not the ones I'm interested in kegs of gunpowder and how much gunpowder is being transported where and how much is being used in a flintlock to shoot off a piece of lead. I'm interested in gunpowder as a tool of diplomacy, as a tool of power, as something that facilitates friendships and rivalries, and is something that, in our period, facilitated an important relationship between the Mohawks and the Dutch. I will be speaking about the Mohawks mostly tonight of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or the people of the Longhouse, colloquially known as the Iroquois. I will probably flip back and forth a little bit just because of the way I've written this talk between those names, but when you hear Haudenosaunee, that they are the Iroquois. The name for the Mohawks are actually the Ganyakahaka, but for the sake of clarity, I will be just using the Mohawks. And I do need to acknowledge that we are in Lenape land this evening. It's important to remember where we come from and who was here before us. And an important way to situate us for this talk is I came to it because of a letter written by Samuel Dresius of the Classes of Amsterdam after the conquest of New Netherland by the English. And he has this line in there that we were of limited gunpowder, and what they had was, fairly wet. It wasn't usable. And I was interested in why that is, and why, gunpowder is a finite resource. It couldn't be made in the colonies. You had to get saltpeter from the Coromandel coast off of India to get to Europe, to mix it with Mediterranean sulfur and Baltic charcoal to make the stuff, and then it had to be sent across the Atlantic to the most important colonies, which was never New Netherland. And so it was interesting to think about how the Dutch managed this finite resource and what they did with it and what they didn't do with it. And what I found was, when I looked through the colonial records, which thankfully for New York are all online to some degree, the Dutch kept giving it away. And so when I set out to write my original seminar paper back in my master's program, I just kind of looked at, all the ways they were doing this. And it wasn't until I sat down to write this in a major way, which became my master's thesis, which is what this talk is compressed into, is it wasn't the Dutch giving it away. The Native Americans were taking it, and they were taking it aggressively. And it made me think about new ways of thinking about the colonial period and relationships between Native Americans and Europeans, and what it meant to have a colony that shared spaces with Native American lands. When we look at this Nikolai Visscher map from the mid-17th century, we see European colonies. I love this map. I'm a total map nerd. But there's no Indians there. What does this mean for them? How do we think about the colonial past as a shared space? And this is what I tried to undertake in this project, is imagining New Netherland as a shared space, a place where Dutch farmers are living along the Munsees, where Dutch traders like Arend van Keur were living along the Mohawks, even having their children. It's a very different story from the one that's been told. And that's what I'm interested in today. Perched atop his horse, with a clear view of the Mohawk castle, Arend van Keur and his envoy waited patiently fully a quarter of an hour while their native host prepared the welcoming ceremony. Van Keur knew the process well. Traveling from village to village into the heart of Mohawk country, he had been well received at every turn with warm welcomes, smooth gift exchanges, and hearty meals hastily prepared just for the occasion. All indications of the immense respect the Mohawks held for their Dutch brother. Just as well, however, these were ceremonies articulated to demonstrate the weight of Mohawk power. Standing in unison, the village's best warriors brandished muskets, took aim at the sky, and fired. The Mohawks took pride in their rising capacity as a military force, and no Dutch colonist had been more instrumental in this feat than Van Keur. Having graciously acknowledged the salute, Van Curler's group approached, guided by the glowing smiles of their hosts that broke through the clearing smoke. There was, he later wrote, great joy among them because I had come. This short cross-cultural exchange, albeit part of a larger initiative in Van Curler's failed attempt to procure French prisoners of war from his Mohawk allies, illuminates several important aspects of the Dutch-Mohawk relationship in the 17th century and a forgotten part of New York history. With the help of Dutch munitions, the Mohawks evolved into a premier imperial force in North America, emboldened to the expansive conquest that would stretch from Iowa to Maine over the following decades. In return, the Dutch received a powerful and feared indigenous ally that could both serve to tie the Dutch economy into the fur trade, while also providing mediation for intermittent Dutch indigenous conflicts, both equally crucial to the colony's economic prosperity and growing population. As the commies of Rensselaerswyck, or essentially the head trading representative, Van Curler brokered an alliance with the Mohawks on their own terms, traveling from his residence near Fort Orange with the gifts that echoed loudly in a world that hinged on commitment and reciprocity. Although Van Curler technically by title represented Rensselaerswyck and not New Netherland, the Mohawks nonetheless perceived him as an ambassador of all Dutch people. Despite lacking any diplomatic titles or duties from the States General or the West India Company, the Mohawks received him as the respected headman he appeared to them to be, with all due ceremony embellished with the fruits of intercultural trade. Van Curler's success would set a precedent for years to come, forcing both William Kieft and later Petrus Stuyvesant to continue trading company munitions to the Mohawks, while attempting to derail the contraband trade the Mohawks willfully encouraged among private Dutch traders like Van Curler. Looking through the eyes of cultural brokers such as Arnold Van Curler or the Mohawk sachem Sagajayakta, I argue the Dutch colonies of New Netherland and Rensselaerswyck and the Mohawk Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy formed a symbiotic relationship facilitated by gunpowder that significantly altered the geopolitical landscape of colonial America. As time wore on and neighboring European colonies and Indian nations grew stronger, the Mohawks and Dutch grew increasingly dependent on one another for survival. These Mohawk-Dutch encounters and negotiations, dictated by the need for gunpowder and pelts, reveals a distinct arc of intertwined fates, outlining their shared rise, peak, and decline within a world embroiled in conflict. As a result of perpetual mourning wars and a colony plagued with indigenous conflicts, New Netherland never possessed adequate stores of guns, powder, and shot to defend itself from invasion, let alone fuel endless Mohawk conquests. The Mohawks survived, but the Dutch did not, relinquishing New Netherland to the English without a shot in 1664. It's not a coincidence. The significance of gunpowder cannot be understated. Gunpowder could not, colonists could not produce gunpowder domestically in the colonial period. As a result, the Dutch were entirely dependent on global European networks for access to it, and by extension, so were the Mohawks. The Dutch were even the leading arms dealers in the 17th century. Saltpeter, gunpowder's chief ingredient, came almost exclusively from the East Indies, forcing Atlantic arms dealers to rely on indirect, amicable diplomatic relations and trade relations with distant Asian polities. Moreover, although the Dutch would lead the global market in munitions by the 17th century, wars in Europe and in more important Atlantic colonies, such as Brazil, left New Netherland at the proverbial bottom of the powder keg. Gunpowder remained scarce in New Netherland to the point Director General Petrus Stuyvesant began maintaining records of it, as if to preemptively prepare a defense for why the colony fell. Nevertheless, despite a clear scarcity of gunpowder in the colony, colonial records suggest that New Netherland's continued existence depended heavily on a consistent flow of gunpowder to the Native American allies, namely the Mohawks. Dutch officials quickly identified a need to facilitate indigenous demands for gunpowder. Less powerful nations such as the Mohawks began seeking munitions from our neighbors, the English, which was a deep fear for the Dutch in this period, is that if they don't give gunpowder to the Indians, they will go to the French or to the English or to the Swedes, as they threatened to and sometimes did. And what's really interesting, and I haven't done research into this yet, but it's really, the timing for this is really fantastic. You have the lift on the company monopsony for private traders in 1639, and literally at the same time in India, there's an agreement with the Sultan that lifts trading bans there that allows Dutch traders to start taking in saltpeter, which they use as ballast, but would also be used in European powder mills in the United Provinces, primarily, I believe, Groningen and a couple other places within the countryside of powder mills that were then bought by the East India Company, West India Company, and it was sort of distributed back out. It's really interesting, but it's not where I've gone yet. The Dutch in New Netherland found themselves in a precarious place. On the one hand, the directors maintained a steady arms trade to placate potential Mohawk aggression. Simultaneously, however, they repeatedly tried and failed to curb the rampant smuggling by men like Van Curler, the illicit traders, who both profited from indigenous demands for munitions but also helped secure the cultural bonds the relationship relied on. As a result, Van Curler and his contemporaries oversaw the unraveling of a precarious relationship of vulnerability that found the Dutch trading away significant portions of their own defensive strength for only a temporary assurance of safety. His actions, while essential to the maintenance of Mohawk allegiance, were part of a larger contraband trade that eventually rendered the colony defenseless. Historians cannot know how much gunpowder flowed into Mohawk hands during New Netherland's existence. Nevertheless, there was but a slender supply of powder when Stuyvesant surrendered the colony. In case in point, something I'm not going to talk about today, but I do write about this, is the Dutch rely on the Mohawks to mediate the end of Kief's War. And there's a big reason why Adrian van der Donck and Van Curler are part of this diplomatic process of getting Mohawks to come down to New Amsterdam to negotiate peace. And it's also part of the tension that raises that conflict, because groups like the Raridans and Wekweskieks and other smaller groups in this area were very upset that the Dutch were only willing to trade gunpowder weaponry to these bigger nations, the Mohicans and the Mohawks, because they didn't want to, one, trade them to people they were living next to, but also because the Mohawks and Mohicans had better gifts in terms of pelts to give back, as opposed to corn, which could be get for metal goods and things like that from these local groups. So there's a lot of animosity there between indigenous peoples as to how this relationship is developing. However optimistic Van Curler may have been of the Mohawk alliance he almost single-handedly cultivated, in the end it would succumb to the inhospitable forces of a contentious colonial landscape. English and French colonizers took exception to the Dutch-sponsored ascendancy of the Mohawks during the 1640s and 50s, and responded by arming their own indigenous allies before eventually acting on it themselves. So essentially you get these proxy wars in place, which is also just fantastically amazing. By the 1660s, the Mohawk-Dutch partnership suffered a mutual political decline, culminating in the loss of New Netherland to the English and a Mohawk nation in retreat. Central to all of this, again, was gunpowder. Through the context of the colonial arms trade, with specific attention to gunpowder, this paper examines the transformation of this intercultural symbiosis from separate factions to brothers in arms, joined together in chains, which is a common metaphor they used at the time to describe this. The first Dutch observers might have described North America as a blessed country where milk and honey flow. But in reality, these initial European traders encountered a volatile landscape stricken by indigenous discord. These ancient rivalries, notably those between the Haudenosaunee and their surrounding neighbors, conjured a vortex that inevitably swallowed the Dutch whole. To be sure, New Netherland's relationship with the Mohawks was unsustainable, but it was also unavoidable. And I need my next slide. Perfect. Thank you so much. Wrong way. So I go to a university that has a phenomenal nationally recognized GIS program, but I don't know how to use it. So I just picked some maps that I was able to kind of find online conveniently until I learned these programs. But essentially, I want to think about the eastern woodlands as a native space. And this is a map that gives you some of the native nations living here. These are primarily the larger ones. And I want to use this map to talk about contact points, which is something I will bring up in a second, but essentially, part of what I'm interested in is rivers and how the geographic makeup of North America affects how colonialism plays out. We have to consider, where Europeans entered and why, and who they ran into when they entered those spaces. So for the Dutch who entered up the Hudson and Delaware rivers, they fell into contact with local Munsee groups and the Haudenosaunee and the Mohicans. The French, who come from the St. Lawrence River Valley, they run into enemies of the Haudenosaunee and the Mohawks. It's really a hugely important geopolitical development that comes out of just incidentally, where they the French form alliances through Champlain with the Hurons, or now known as the Wendots, the Algonquins, the Montagnais, who are part of the Penobscot or Wabanaki Confederacy, excuse me, and this is going to be really important. No, those are the Great Lakes. Yeah, the map's it's too big for the Finger Lakes, but important question. And you can see generally, I mean, this entire pink area involves the Haudenosaunee in this period. These people are traveling, hundreds, thousands of miles to distant lands, and they're bringing Dutch guns and gunpowder with them. That's the way to the interior. Yes, through interior river networks. Just quick anecdote: if anybody's read Lisa Brooks's *The Common Pot*, she has this really fantastic map in there that I wish I just stole. It's got, essentially North America, but just rivers, no political borders, anything like that. And even my advisor was looking at this, like, where's the land? It's amazing how everything is so interconnected with interior waterways. Following the methodology of Kathleen Duvall's The Native Ground, I have set out to describe the 17th century Northeast as a predominantly native space. My intent here is to blur the lines that separated Native Americans and Europeans, instead illustrating a space that was often shared, a space in which the fabric of fates of feeble European colonies and Indian nations became increasingly entangled, and as a result, a space in which the first generations of Europeans struggled to survive in. The Dutch, for instance, tried and failed to establish themselves in the native world embroiled in conflict, one the Mohawks navigated with exceptional prowess by drawing from years of cultural experiences and traditions molded over generations of change. Placing New Netherland in this indigenous interior world, seen here, thus also becomes a useful lens for which to map out Mohawk imperial ambitions, as they utilized ancient lakes, rivers, and streams to exert imperial dominance over eastern North America. It was their world the Dutch had entered. I think it is important to stress, however, that this is neither a history of Iroquois nor New Netherland, but a reconstruction of the world in which both spheres oscillated with considerable overlap that was often indistinguishable. This interpretation seeks to unveil a neutral perspective that captures the ambitious actions and ideas of both Dutch and Mohawk people. Indeed, I adopt neither the declension models of past Iroquois historians nor the emphasis on understanding colonial America through a static interpretation of violence alone. Instead, we uncover an intense saga that begins with the burgeoning relationship between two culturally independent peoples, that through the colonial gunpowder trade rapidly evolved into a symbiotic alliance that would drastically alter the colonial landscape, leaving an impact that would then be felt well after the English takeover, the crater of which is still being excavated by historians and archaeologists today. And so part of that relationship we see in an engraving like this from the mid-17th century. I believe the earliest I've ever seen this engraving is done is 1628, but I'm not sure how accurate that is. And this is supposed to be just New Amsterdam with, sort of a multicultural feel to it. And that's really what New Netherland was. It was Indians and colonists trading side by side constantly. So what I'm implying here, and this is important, is there still remains a false perception of 1664 as an impermeable boundary in the historical timeline for New Netherland. A close look into the gunpowder trade and the Dutch relationship with the Iroquois, if facilitated, uncovers unseen lines of continuity that stretch well beyond 1664. For the sake of this study, 1664 was a convenient stopping point, but there is definitely more to be done with the Dutch trade that stayed behind and the traditions that permeated the Haudenosaunee's later relationship with the English. And if this project becomes something great, I'm really interested in essentially, it's how the Dutch relationship with the Mohawks becomes the model that the English are forced to adopt. And I'm finding evidence of this tangential so far, but I'm hoping to find more of how this affects King Philip's War and Bacon's Rebellion, as the English rely on the Mohawks as sort of their go-to ally in these conflicts. And it's because of the Dutch that happens. New Netherland's geographic location in this native world is more significant than scholars have realized. In the early 1600s, both the French and Dutch entered North America at different focal points, ultimately aligning themselves on opposite sides of a long-standing rivalry between the Haudenosaunee and the Northern Indian League of Algonquins, Montagnais, and Hurons. The effects were immediate when in 1609, Samuel de Champlain's arquebuses gunned down 3 Mohawk war chiefs in a battle intended by the northern Indians to showcase the new power that had fallen into their hands. The Iroquois needed a European partner to balance the scales, one that was also a master of this new gunpowder technology. Historians have traditionally used this moment to describe 2 related but distinct trajectories: the beginnings of a long and bitter rivalry between the French and the Five Nations, and the deadly impact of European firearms on technologically inferior Native American peoples. As David Silverman has argued, however, this analysis is incomplete when one considers the broader trajectory of Indians' assessment and adoption of firearms. The ironic result of the colonists' superiority in firearms, Silverman explains, was the Indians' so-called skulking way of war, which plagued Euro-American society throughout the colonial era. Indeed, this Champlain thesis, as Silverman calls it, was not paradigmatic as a moment from which Native Americans collectively declined in an inevitably deterministic pattern akin to Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Instead, we have a transformative saga in which Native American groups such as the Mohawks embraced gunpowder technology. Champlain's shot marked the beginning of a new era in Iroquois and Native American warfare, setting in motion the gradual transition of the Mohawks to gunpowder technology that would gain traction in the coming decades. This gunpowder would be Dutch in origin, but it was the Mohawks that make the most of its power. Conveniently for the Mohawks, the Dutch were the perfect arms suppliers. By the 1630s, the United Provinces were firmly established as the leading arms dealers of the world, with supply lines linked to the Baltic, Mediterranean, and East Indies. Trading in gunpowder required connections to the East Indies and the cooperation of the East India Company, allowing for the swift development of commercial markets within which guns, powder, and ammunition were sold to international bidders, regardless of diplomatic relations. Something else that's really funny is you have Dutch gunpowder being sold to the English when they're at war against them. It's very bizarre, and I can't explain it. I'm hoping somebody can someday. Moreover, many Dutch traders were perfectly willing to trade munitions for beavers, often at exorbitant prices. Although historians of New Netherland have mostly focused on the, quote, wampum revolution, I argue the colonial arms market deserves added attention. The Mohawks were purchasing guns early and paid steep prices for them. Dutch traders exploited Mohawk demands for guns, powder, and shot to the fullest extent. During the 1630s, firelock weapons, typically flintlocks, could be furnished for roughly 12 guilders and a pound of gunpowder for 2 guilders. The Mohawks, in turn, paid 5 to 10 times that production cost and up to 120 guilders per gun and 12 guilders per gunpowder, equating to approximately 20 and 2 beaver pelts, respectively. Gunsmiths in New Netherland could make additional profits by charging Mohawk warriors for repairs, a practice that Mohawks took considerable exception to throughout the 17th century. You see frequently in meetings when the Mohawks harangue the Dutch for various wrongs in the relationship, they complain that the Dutch are charging them to fix their guns when the Mohawks consider them as brethren and they should be free. But you know the Dutch. But this connection was not formed overnight. The Dutch were reluctant at first to trade guns to the Mohawks. Up until roughly 1640, Mohawk-Dutch relations remained particularly rocky as the Dutch would quickly find North America as a volatile landscape, with indigenous conflicts like the Mohawk-Mohican War, an episode that, although short, left Dutch colonists fearing for their lives. I'm planning on doing more with this, but essentially my interpretation is the Mohawks are trying to fight the Sakokis, who are in northern New England at this point, and they're going to keep coming back in this story, so we'll keep on them. Later in 1632, the Mohawks demonstrated their displeasure for the newly appointed commies of Fort Orange, Hans Huntum, in a brutal onslaught led by Sagadryakta that burned the company's sloop and slaughtered most of Killian Van Rensselaer's cattle. As a result, heavy friction left the Dutch-Mohawk partnership relatively ambiguous in the 1630s, neither side entirely sure of how to best utilize the other. This all changed in the 1640s when Arend van Curler stepped in to renew the peace between the Mohawks and the Dutch. As a representative of Rensselaerswyck, a patroonship that enjoyed a separate jurisdiction from New Netherland, Van Curler made the most of his connections to facilitate an arms trade with the Mohawks. Much to the chagrin of his boss, Killian Van Rensselaer, Van Curler spent most of his time, quote, in the woods, away from prying eyes of the West India Company employees. He learned the Mohawk language and even conceived a child with a Mohawk woman, thus demonstrating his importance among the Mohawk people who let him in as a member of their extended kin. Van Curler and the Mohawks were literally brothers, and as the Mohawks remembered this connection for years. Well after 1664, the Iroquois would collectively refer to the governor of New York as Collier in ode to this relationship. And as far as this relationship goes, it was formed in a concept the Haudenosaunee called Caswenta, which is the two-row tradition marked by a two-row wampum belt. And it's essentially separate but equal. You're in one stream, and you can go opposite ways, and you're together, but you're not hindering each other's business. And this was how the Iroquois, and the Mohawks specifically, as the keepers of the Eastern Door, absorbed the Dutch into the Longhouse as extended kin. In 1643, Van Curler and the Dutch had reasons to believe a bright future was on the horizon. As Wim Klooster has argued, the Dutch Empire in the Atlantic reached its greatest extent in 1642, following the additions of Luanda, Sao Tome, and expansion in West Africa and Brazil, all on the heels of Iberian disunion, which was just a fantastic national moment for the Dutch. After years of struggling to establish themselves in North America in the same way, the Dutch finally conceded any progress to be made in North America would only become with the cooperation of the Mohawks. By July 1640, Kilian van Rensselaer dropped his charges of indemnity against the Mohawks for killing his cattle years prior. He would not let that go for a long time. A change of heart likely influenced by the success of William Pynchon to divert Mohawk trade towards Springfield, which sits on this essentially Native American highway between the Mohawks and the Narragansetts, who were also allies at this time. So if you want to be a good trader, you set yourself on these traffic networks and you kind of hope people stop by, and they did. And anyway, Kilian van Rensselaer instructs Van Curler to go into the woods with some blankets and other goods, including, I'm assuming, gunpowder, which is illegal, so the records don't essentially mention it all the time explicitly, but it's there. And he instructs Van Curler at this point to go back into the woods and form a relationship with the Mohawks and make amends. Accordingly, 3 very fine blankets were distributed in Van Rensselaer's name to 3 sachems, the first being Sagodryakta, who Van Rensselaer took careful attention to mention by name, and the other 2, the 2 chiefs who had to the greatest credit and power among the Mohawks, or to one of the principal men of the Mohicans. So in essence, Van Rensselaer is also saying, like, find whichever powerful people you can and give them a blanket. We need their business and support. Doing so was no difficult task, however, for Van Curler, who was already known to spend, quote, too much time in the woods, and had even constructed the patroon's house conspicuously close to the Mohawks. The letters detailing Van Curler's vivid ideas for the Dutch colonization of North America may not have survived, but his intentions and actions certainly make them clear. Excuse me. The outgrowth of illicit trading in guns, powder, and shot and liquor as well from Rensselaer's fight completely changed the nature of trading around Fort Orange. Almost immediately, official company trade at Fort Orange declined, while a local population of private traders quickly sprouted. Like Van Curler, these traders were commonly known as boschloppers, or coureurs de bois, these sort of woods runners. Like Van Curler, these traders were commonly known as boschloppers, secret merchants who defied the West India Company directives by peddling their contraband wares of brokering trade with native inhabitants in the forests. Under the cover of foliage, these private traders, well provisioned with high-quality trade goods such as textiles and firearms, undercut company prices and utilized the lack of locally centralized government offices to forge intercultural partnerships and alliances. Traditionally, historians have portrayed these traders in specific terms as strong-armed merchants, not above resorting to physical abuse or intimidation to acquire business of Mohawk patrons. While violence did indeed pervade many of these encounters, however, the treatment of these incidents as evidentiary fragments of a frontier where civility vanished, quote, does little to push forth an understanding of intercultural relationships, especially ones the Mohawks often controlled. And here I have, I just wanted to get some nice colorful slides today. It's a painting by Len Tentilla of Fort Orange around 1630 is when he envisioned it. And what I love about this painting in particular is the forest in the background. When we see these maps, these broad maps of space, we don't really see the foliage. We don't see the estuaries and rivers where trade was often taking place in darkness and away from metropolitan officials where they couldn't see it. And I just love that juxtaposition there, as well as you see a canoe right in the front, again, hinting at these intercultural relationships that were being harbored every single day. Private traders eager to turn a quick profit and return to Europe were even less likely to abide by colonial regulations, while some families might have resorted to illegal measures in times of need. Itinerant traders disinterested in settling permanently in the New World felt less inclined to obey local regulations that protected the security of New Netherland. Hence, smuggling remained a continuous problem through the entirety of the colony's duration. The high demands of profitability for selling guns, powder, and shot enticed private traders. Although legal ordinances made participation in the contraband trade punishable by death, the West India Company appears to have been lenient on the issue. Adopting the same policies used to deal with matters of religious tolerance, the directors encouraged Stuyvesant to, quote, take good care that through this winking no more ammunition be sold than each one had need of for protection. These ordinances were continually renewed to no avail. Private traders continued smuggling contraband to the Indians, and the colonial administration lacked the means of stopping them. Even then, not all of those who were necessarily punished. In 1648, when Stuyvesant uncovers an underground supply line that smuggled munitions from the coastal bays to Fort Orange, colonists successfully petitioned the release of the perpetrators. Jacob Brynson and Jacob Schermerhorn, who were then allowed to return to Fort Orange, where they became important political officials in the local councils. And I'm not going to speak too much on this today, but essentially these guys had partners in English New Haven. They would get in powder and guns from some sort of private trader, take it on their ship, and this is all done illicitly, so they're not paying customs, and on top of that, it's an illegal good. And what's fascinating is they would drop these casks, somewhere in the water, come back at night, pick it up, and so what you have is this remarkable network that these two, as well as others, were dealing with, where you have powder coming in from places like New Haven or somewhere down in the Delaware, and then it's being trekked up to Fort Orange, where it's then traded to Mohawks or Mohicans illicitly. And it's really fascinating. And Stuyvesant, he tries to put a stop on this immediately until he learns how essential it is. And it's just fascinating. But the Europeans don't like it. French, Swedish, and English observers blamed the Dutch for the rise of the Mohawks and promptly demanded Stuyvesant to cease and desist the dangerous liberty of trading guns, powder, and shot to the Indians. Stuyvesant was quick to point the finger back, but he also knew from his recent attempts to cut off the munitions network of Brynson and Schermerhorn that halting the illicit trade in gunpowder was beyond his control. He was well aware of Hovert Lokerman's contraband network well before the governor of New Haven, Theophilus Eaton, complained of Lokerman's selling of powder, guns, and shot to the Indians with the intention to instigate the Indians there against the English. That was a common concern among others, the Dutch included. Stuyvesant stood firm, refusing to concede any knowing of Lokerman's activities he most certainly knew to be true. Dissatisfied with Stuyvesant's ploy, Governor Eaton fired back with a letter that illustrates the remarkable yet unsettling underground network Lokermans have created. The region concerning this dangerous trade, Eaton explained, stretches from Fort Aranya, or Fort Orange, Long Island within the River of Connecticut, at Narragansett Bay, and other places within the English jurisdictions. He describes Lokerman's crooked and perverse way on Long Island as well. With every coat, he would give a pound of powder. And the same Indians further testified that Hovert wished them to cut off the English and the Dutch to such a work, would furnish them with pieces, powder, and shot enough. Stuyvesant had no answer, but he knew eventually the English would. And so one thing again is that the Dutch aren't the only ones trading in powder, so the English are also, they're voicing these concerns because they know they're doing it as well, as everybody's trading gunpowder to the Indians in some capacity, but they're angry at everybody else for doing it. And the other thing, I love this anecdote, is there's this man, Hovert Ertsen, who gets arrested in Rhode Island by an English captain because his first name was Hovert, and he shows up in the records in New Amsterdam applying for ID because he was arrested thinking that he was Hovert Lokermans. And it's one of those funny things. I just picture a 17th century DMV and a pissed off guy who hasn't been trading powder to anyone, or maybe well has. 17th century is just a funny place. Meanwhile, outside New Netherlands borders, Mohawk ascendancy in the 1640s and 50s, culminating in the dispersal of the Huron Confederacy, prompted many of the enemies to begin building arsenals of their own, so that by 1660 the tables had turned. The Susquehannocks had access to guns, powder, and lead from the English in the Chesapeake, specifically Maryland, as well as Dutch and Swedish traders who knew how to play one power off another. The Mohicans and their eastern allies wasted no time in acquiring gunpowder weapons either. Aside from the Dutch trading at Fort Orange and the Fort of Good Hope on the Connecticut River, the Indians of the upper Connecticut River Valley, such as the Pocumtucks, Pennacox, and Secocos, who the Mohicans had allied with after the war, and they were known rivals of the Mohawks, most likely received guns from the Pynchon traders in Springfield. These Indians benefited from connections to New France as well, with the Western Abenakis acting as gun runners between French traders and their Algonquin-speaking allies in New England. The Dutch, for their part, worried these campaigns would bring about potentially hazardous consequences for the colony. Soon enough, retaliatory raids from New England Indians began striking the area around Fort Orange. Indeed, the Mohawks would eventually recover from the ordeals of the 1660s, but their Dutch brothers would not. Population loss from recurrent bouts with smallpox and receding beaver populations forced the Five Nations to stretch beyond its means, forcing the Mohawks into recoil by the 1660s. The elimination of the Eries and Neutrals forced the Iroquois war parties to search Western Ontario for remaining pockets of Iroquois-speaking Wendots to be used as captives. A recent defeat of the Ojibwas in 1662 signaled a changing tide and reflected the breaking down of the Iroquois war machine. The same could be said for the defeat by the Susquehannocks along the Ohio River. No longer maintaining the advantage in arms, the Iroquois forces were little prepared to topple a reconfigured fort defended by both cannons and gunmen that they had received from Maryland, the Susquehannocks. The Mohawks were fighting in New England for different reasons, mainly. The recession of beaver populations in lower New England had led them to, again, go searching for more. They relied on the Pequots to some degree and other groups that they had sort of formed a tributary status with, and the decline of beaver populations really changes all of this. Though scholars aren't still sure how much beaver populations actually decline or what have you. It's still an ongoing debate. The Mohawks were fighting, excuse me, it's a little dark. Access to Dutch guns and an unwillingness to make peace with New France made them especially dependent on Dutch trade during these years. As one Mohawk emissary put it, quote, "We are brothers and are joined together with chains, but that only lasts as long as we have beavers." Their efforts to push north into Maine and as far as Nova Scotia indicate their persistence to maintain trade with the Dutch. The Mohawks needed beavers to obtain guns, powder, and shot, and vice versa. It was a vicious cycle. Soon after the Mohawk raids in Nova Scotia, Governor Sir Thomas Temple warned Stuyvesant, "If matters remain as they are, then we are sure the Mohawks will be shortly attacked by the English neighbors and the savages." And this is just so these are some collective items. If you go on the New Netherland Institute, there's a lot of helpful educational resources, and they have some pictures of artifacts. So on top, you have a gun barrel. To the right is a gun hammer, and then in the New York State Museum, which has an exhibit on Fort Orange open until May 5th this year. It's been open, I think, for 2 years now. They have this 1630s cannon that was in Fort Orange. And I should mention as well, David Silverman's book, Thundersticks, is very fantastic for Native American usage of guns in a much broader period. And he has this great anecdote about this fur trade museum that's way out western Nebraska, like almost on the border with Colorado, where essentially they're one of the only museums that has these flintlocks or rifles that Native Americans used. And when Native Americans used them, they often altered them. And because of that, most museums don't like them. Because they've been, the barrels have been sawed or whatever, but that's one of the few museums out in western Nebraska that actually has them, and it's really fascinating. As the Mohawks suffered, so too did the Dutch. New Netherlands' economy continued to give way to the fur, as the fur trade showed signs of a crash. Indian wars around the colony and the decline of the Mohawks and Haudenosaunee slowed the incoming stream of pelts, and prices skyrocketed as a result of private Dutch, English, and French traders. Moreover, New Netherland was once again embroiled in conflict of its own when conflict broke out at Esopus, again in 1659 and again in 1663, steadily draining the limited resources that remained in the colony as the West India Company stumbled towards bankruptcy. Making matters worse, the continued encroachment of the English into Oostdorp or Westchester and Long Island seemed to confirm the rumors of preparations for an incoming Anglo invasion. good timing, actually. Okay. The Mohawk-Dutch partnership had seemingly run its course, no longer capable of sustaining the increasing outside pressures of Native American conflicts and European advances. Dutch attempts to remain neutral in Mohawk affairs grew increasingly ineffective. In the late 1650s, Mohawk requests to Fort Orange officials for diplomatic assistance with the French fell on deaf ears. Lamontagne, one of the officials of Fort Orange, sent out a small delegation in 1658 to no avail, and subsequent requests were ignored. The French, too, took a position of neutrality, excuse me, rather than assist in resolving the conflict. As Trelease notes, both the Dutch and French were content to let their Indian allies do most of the fighting. Nevertheless, these European strategies of neutrality rarely produced the desired result, with Dutch, French, and English colonial governments constantly finding themselves entangled in the contests of their indigenous allies. Observations of animosity among local Indian groups, in addition to incoming attacks by New England Indians and the Susquehannock, suggest the Dutch may have perceived Mohawk vulnerability and consequently their own. For years now, the Mohawks have provided a reliable buffer zone for the Dutch, but their waning power did not bode well for the colony, especially given the growing resentment neighboring Indian nations and Europeans felt for the Dutch and their involvement in the Mohawks' rise in power. Cold's starting to catch up with me. Excuse me. Their fates were intertwined. Iroquois recession during these years, combined with Dutch instability, made New Netherland particularly susceptible to invasion of the English and their native foes. In 1663, things took a turn for the worse. By September, Stuyvesant received his latest complaint from Colonel Temple on Nova Scotia, bemoaning of the most recent developments in the war between the Mohawks and the Sakokis. The Mohawk sachem, Saheda, defended the actions of the Mohawks, recalling to the Fort Orange officials that he had warned Temple to not trouble himself between them, the Mohawks, and their northern Indians. In the face of Temple's request for peace, the Mohawks showing no signs of backing down. Moreover, Temple's letter contained in its alarming new development for the Mohawks and Dutch. The English were no longer fearful of attacking the Mohawks themselves. As the English encroachments into Oostdorp and Newissink increased in the 1660s, so too did threats of violence. That December, the Mohawks suffered another major defeat to the Sakokis at Fort Hill. Before leaving, the Iroquois war party stopped at Fort Orange, likely for munitions, where they were told by Lamontagne, that the planned expedition was a response to a previous defeat that left a number of Mohawks and Senecas dead. Evidently, the Mohawks had attempted a peace offering from the Sakoki without consulting the Senecas and Onondagas. When the latter pressed the Mohawks to renew hostilities, the Mohawks stepped back, reluctant to, quote, storm their castle, for it is strong and cannot be taken by us. Ultimately, however, the Mohawks were finally persuaded to join, and they would lose the most men in the fight. Sakoki gunmen successfully warded off an early onslaught of Mohawks, Seneca, and Onondaga warriors. In desperation, the attackers furnished an improvised explosive from a sack of gunpowder they had ignited and hurled over the palisades. The Sakoki defenders quickly extinguished the flames. Utterly defeated, the Iroquois withdrew, wounded, captive list, and at least 100 men short. The truth was hard to bear. The Mohawks and their allies no longer held an advantage in firepower. By the 1660s, the Dutch had grown numb to the arms trade that they initially sought to prevent in earlier years. After Stuyvesant failed attempts to halt the illicit arms trade, which after his arrival in 1647, the court hardly regulated the trade other than reposting previous ordinances and punishments of death. Indeed, in the court proceedings in which the West India Company shamelessly chastised Stuyvesant for surrendering the colony, the company officials evidenced the open knowledge that gunpowder had become the most important good of the fur trade, with private merchants taking care to thoroughly provision themselves for the annual trading season. Many of these merchants sold guns, powder, and lead indiscriminately to Indians, regardless of whether or not they were allies or enemies of the colony. In fact, during the final year of the war with the Esopus, the enemy Indians were free to arm themselves from the flea market of sloops floating on the Hudson. The Mohawks took advantage of this freelance trade themselves, as one Dutch observer noted when he observed 2 Mohawks paddling down the Hudson, and I love this, with an estimated 300 pounds of gunpowder and 400 pounds of lead. How? Moreover, although most of the presents given at diplomatic meetings usually consisted of gunpowder and lead, by the 1660s the Dutch appear to have been designing firearms specifically for their native partners. As David Silverman has pointed out, Indian guns took on a lighter design than the European equivalent, clearly adjusted for the long-distance transportation necessitated Iroquois warfare and hunting. The thought that the Dutch embraced the Indian demands is rather unsettling when the effects of the trade on the colony's downfall are considered. Did it come up? Did I hit the wrong thing? Oh boy. I muted it. There we go. So this is a Hudson Bay rifle that the British were trading with Indians, but I mean it appears that there's a little bit of continuity to this and a broader tradition where Europeans, like the Dutch, they branded their guns with a serpent god meant to be the Thunderbird, which was a symbol of death and shamanism, but also the spirit of thunder and lightning. And it just tells you how Europeans catered to indigenous epistemologies, and these markets were essentially cultivated for indigenous interests, which I think is just fascinating. New Netherland fell in 2 different worlds simultaneously. Rumors circulated of English and Indian collusion directed at both the Mohawks and Dutch. While the inhabitants of New Amsterdam braced for the incoming English fleet, the Dutch settlers in Beverwijk and Rensselaerswijk feared an Indian massacre. Evidence suggests that the English were instigating animosity between the Mohicans and the Dutch and the Mohawks, but an attack from the north was not out of the question either. Everything is very uncertain here, wrote Jeremias van Rensselaer, and we do not know which side misfortune will strike us, nor what is hanging above our heads. In desperation, the colonists beckoned Stuyvesant for help, who wasted no time in getting to Fort Orange to instigate matters himself. No sooner did Stuyvesant reach Fort Orange than the sails of 4 English frigates appeared over the horizon of present-day New York Harbor. Under the command of Sir Richard Nichols, the fleet disembarked their soldiers about 2 miles off of Gravesend and weighed anchor in Nyack, guns trained on Fort Amsterdam. To the south, the English settlers of Long Island, some of whom, having lived under the Dutch jurisdiction for years, began forming ranks. To the east, Englishmen on foot and horseback were arriving by the day, hotly bent on plundering the place, as the quote goes. To top it off, their forces included a concourse of, quote, 600 Northern Indians and 150 French privateers, which no evidence of this as far as I know, but just astoundingly, this multi-international coalition attacking the Dutch. I think it's fascinating. In haste, Stuyvesant quickly made his way back to New Amsterdam, whereupon he had a letter penned off to Nichols to inquire about his business. Nichols' reply came the next morning. Stuyvesant would either surrender the fort and colony to the English or face the mysteries of war. Despite the tendency of some historians to mistake Stuyvesant's stubbornness for his foolishness, Stuyvesant knew resistance was out of the question. With a shortage of men, defenses in disrepair, and only a slender supply of powder either in the fort or in the town, the Dutch stood no chance against the multinational force that surrounded the fort on all sides. The English had conquered a shell of a colony, a shattered mosaic of Mohawk-Dutch dreams, and economic promises that gave way to the intense geopolitical environment that made native North America so difficult to survive in. Historians of this period and of Dutch-Indian relations in general have developed the unfortunate tendency to gravitate around the cultures of violence and conflict that tore the colony apart. With undeniable certainty, analysis of the gunpowder trade solidifies many of their claims. Indeed, as David Silverman has profoundly demonstrated, firearms directly contributed to the violent transformation of Native America. Yet, there is a whole other world that this study of the gunpowder trade uncovers, one of the alliances and accommodation. Through the eyes of individuals, both cultural leaders and intercultural brokers, different patterns and themes became clearer and more pronounced. Taking the perspective of Saga-Dryakta or Arne van Curler, we begin to see the world they shared in more complex ways than what may be reduced to a frontier or borderland. Their worlds overlap considerably, and historians must continue to work towards reconstructing this shared space. Thank you. Okay. So I'll repeat the, the question is, in 1664, did the Dutch have any reasonable expectations of the Mohawks to help them? It's a fun question. It's one I've been wrestling with, and to some degree, I think Stuyvesant did hope that the Mohawks would help them to some degree when this time came, but I think in the moment they knew that it was, well beyond over. The Mohawks had a major smallpox epidemic strike in 1663. And I had fun writing about this in conjunction with an earthquake and sort of how, like, spiritually it's just a disaster. The 1660s are awful for both groups. But essentially the Mohawks are in no position to defend themselves. And there's a simultaneous fear that, and it somewhat materializes that there's also a force of Mohican-led group that goes to Albany to attack the Mohawks. So the Dutch and Mohawks are virtually attacked at the exact same time, which again, I think sparks more interest in this shared experience of Indian nation and European colony. Yep. Okay.
Hi, I wanted to find out how popular the gunpowder arms became since, say, 1623-24, when New Amsterdam was forming, among Lenape and the nearby Algonquin people. So the arms, were they popular at the time already when the New Amsterdam was formed, or?
So just to clarify, were they you mean popular among Europeans or Native Americans?
No, Native Americans. I mean Lenape specifically.
Okay, so this is the period that's the toughest to read. So the question is, how popular were firearms among Native American groups by the 1620s? So this is a process that develops rather slowly. We have the first instance, as far as we know, that's documented is 1609, when Champlain has these 3 arquebuses, and he says that he killed these Indians himself. We're not sure if that's actually true. He tended to exaggerate. But essentially, it's that moment, the Champlain thesis, as David Silverman calls it, that Native Americans realize what gunpowder technology can do. But Europeans are their populations are still sparse at this point. They're mostly just itinerant traders who come in and leave. There's no, most of them aren't trying to establish long-term connections, and most of them would come in with the expectation of trading once, getting some cash, and getting back out. So the connections themselves have to develop, and there's still, a lot of cross-cultural uncertainty about whether or not we should be trading weapons to enemies and things like that. Like hatchets are one thing because they're multi-purpose, but guns, they can be used for hunting, but Europeans were still very uncertain about that. And I'm not sure, I think it takes a little bit of time for a market awareness to develop for traders to actually know this is what they want and we're going to give it to them. And then there's the company monopsony that plays into this, and who can trade guns changes after 1639. So in the 1620s and 30s, it's very, very limited. The Mohawks likely tried to use Dutch guns in the Mohawk-Mohican conflict. I think that's why Van Kriekenbeck, unfortunately gets roped into this whole thing, and he ends up dying as a result because the Mohicans, tried to use his forces for help in the way Champlain sort of did. But before the 1640s, it's very limited. It becomes obvious in the 1630s at some point that the Dutch and the English are trading arms, the English at Springfield. But it's not until the 1640s that I really see any evidence that indigenous people are actually looking for a gun market, so to speak.
Thank you.
Yep. So we got the one in front and then the one back.
You mentioned Silverman as a source.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you mentioned Silverman as a source. Are there any other sources that we can read to flesh out this area and time?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, again, what other historians have written about this. So David Silverman's book Thundersticks is a fantastic place to start. It's actually, it's a real struggle to figure, because he did so much just in this one chapter that like I have to kind of carve around it. It's very frustrating, but he knows that. So that book Thundersticks has one chapter on the Dutch-Mohawk relationship that covers, very much the entirety of this relationship in very broad strokes. And that's a good place to start. There are a couple of books on the Iroquois. One, Dan Richter's Ordeal of the Longhouse, which is old now. It came out in '92. That book is still very good, but has been superseded in many ways by John Parmenter's newer The Edge of the Woods. But Dan Richter's book is more readable than John Parmenter's. John Parmenter's it's a really academic study. He's doing a lot of complex theories that are very important but not necessarily digestible to some people. So I recommend, trying to get a mix of both. And then there's other books as well that deal with this, in tangential ways, like Susanna Shaw Romney's book, New Netherland Connections. And Wim Klooster has some stuff on New Netherland, but not much. And then everybody I think is aware of Jaap Jacobs' tome, New Netherland, and then Cornell's version of that, The Colony of New Netherland, which is an anthropological look at the colony. He doesn't deal too much with this, but Jacobs is, the main source for anything in this area as far as Dutch goes. She was next.
Hi, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I was wondering, actually my question's quite similar to the previous one. How do you go about finding primary sources about the behaviors and motivations of the Mohawks, for example?
So the question is, how do you go about finding primary sources and documentation about the Mohawks, and how do we extract, what they're doing from those sources? It's very challenging. There's no right answer to this question. If I was I'm not going to say I'm not a professional historian, but if I'm a professional historian writing on a book project of this, the good thing to do is to go speak to Haudenosaunee communities and ask them, what is the oral tradition about this? How do you guys feel about this past? How do you tell it? What does this history mean to you? And I have an anecdote that I'd actually like to speak about very briefly, if we can. As far as primary sources go, the great thing about New York State compared to other places is that a lot of the primary sources have been digitized and are available online. You can get the original O'Callaghan records, which is a documentary records of the colonial history of the state of New York. There are 15 volumes that include the Dutch period but go into the English period, and those were, translated by Callahan in the 19th century, and they're a little problematic. But if you go to the New Netherland Institute, I believe it's newnetherlandinstitute.org, I think it's a .org, they have an entire research section of their website dedicated to the records that O'Callaghan used, that Charlie Gehring and Yanni Venema are so courageously going through and retranscribing and retranslating more accurately than O'Callaghan did. And everything that they've done so far is available free for download. And that's most of the sources. You can also look at the Jesuit relations if you're interested more with what the Iroquois are doing specifically, as well as the Massachusetts Historical Society records. There's more you can play with. Pennsylvania has more stuff. Maryland has more stuff because the Iroquois are just going all over the place. So it's like wherever they go, the Europeans are documenting them, and they're very anxious about it. How do you read what they're doing, though, is a tougher question. You really had it it's a mix of reading against the grain and then kind of just putting events together. Why are Mohawks complaining about gunpowder and not about, say, the French trying to proselytize them? Why are the Mohawks doing this? There's no easy way or even specific way to answer that question, but it's really just reading an eye for their perspective. And that's where I started with this whole story, is, I was reading it one way. I was interested in, there was a Dutch soldier who was leaving gunpowder for an Indian prostitute that he was sleeping with. He would just leave a keg on the beach at night, and she would take it. There was, after Kief's War, Raritans sachems like Pennaceck was ransoming Dutch soldiers and colonists for gunpowder specifically. And so for me, it was just, why do Indians want this stuff? And what does it mean for them that they have to rely on the Dutch to get it? And that's kind of, with the Iroquois, there's an existing historiography that's really changing. Richard White's The Middle Ground is very famous for how he paints the Iroquois as a menacing empire that shatters the Midwest. And that's now all being revised, but this history of Iroquois imperialism is still kind of in place. And people debate whether or not there was really an empire, but we do know to some degree that the Iroquois were expanding for either want of captives or hunting grounds or just political power, so to speak. You know, it's tough to figure out these things definitively, but we can make arguments. And I did want to share one tiny thing. It's very fast. I didn't want to do it in case we didn't get to it. So there's a notebook at the Antiquarian Society in Worcester where I'm currently studying. And it chronicles, it was donated by Thomas Jefferson when the Antiquarian Society was founded, and it chronicles sort of English history, French history, Native American history. We think it was constructed for Governor Burnet in New York in the 1740s. And it's essentially like it's a compilation of different accounts. And what I find so interesting about this is the Mohawks, and this is cited by Dan Richter's old article, Rediscovered Links in the Covenant Chain, that came out in like 1980, where he found this. There's 3 meetings that the Iroquois have with the English in 1676, 1689, and 1692. And in all 3 of these meetings, they reference Van Curler. They reference the Dutch. And so I sometimes start with this when I begin this talk, but I want to end with it because it shows that the Dutch history was just as important to the Iroquois then as it should be now. That's something I want us to take away from this.
That's an excellent way to end.
Thank you.